The Christian Trinity. For a lot of people, that word just brings up these images of complicated diagrams, weird math, a doctrine that feels so abstract it has nothing to do with real life. But what if I told you it's been called one of the most dangerous, laborious, and ultimately profitable ideas in the history of thought? Okay, let's get into this.
The 20th century theologian Karl Rahner, he kind of hit on a really big problem. He noticed that for most Christians, if you just took the Trinity out of their faith, not much would actually change day to day. It had become this piece of theological jargon, right? A math problem sitting on a dusty shelf, totally disconnected from real life.
So that's really the big question we're tackling. We're going to unpack what the doctrine of the Trinity actually is, how it even came to be, and why the early church felt like they were walking on a razor's edge, where just one tiny misstep could lead to complete disaster.
To really get the Trinity, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, back to this fundamental puzzle that the very first Christians had to solve, and they had to do it using their own scriptures.
So the foundation of their entire faith, which they got from Judaism, was absolute monotheism. There is one God, period. That was the one thing you just didn't mess with. But this core belief created a huge tension when they started looking at the rest of their texts.
Because right alongside that one God rule, they kept running into a distinct Father, and they worshipped a Son, Jesus, who did things only God could do, like forgive sins, and who was even called God. Then they experienced a Holy Spirit, who is also identified as God. They even found these little hints of plurality in their oldest scriptures, like when God says, "Let us make man in our image." So how in the world do you hold all that together? One God, but also a Father, a Son, and a Spirit.
This puzzle sent the early church on a journey that lasted for centuries, all to find the right words to explain it. And believe me, this was not some safe, quiet academic exercise. This was a dangerous journey to try and define the undefinable.
And the great theologian Augustine of Hippo, he absolutely nailed the stakes involved. He knew that getting this strong wasn't just, failing a test. In their minds, a wrong view of God could corrupt the very heart of everything. Worship, how you live, the entire church.
People have compared this whole process to walking along Striding Edge. It's this famously narrow mountain ridge in England. Just picture it. You're balanced on this tiny path, and on your left, there's a sheer drop, and on your right, there's another one just as deadly. For the early church, one wrong step in either direction meant falling headfirst into heresy.
So, what were these dangerous cliffs? Well, on one side, you had what's called modalism. This idea tries to solve the puzzle by saying, look, God is just one person who shows up in three different modes, or masks, kind of like an actor. The problem? That completely blurs the distinct persons we see in the Bible. Then on the other side of the path, you had the huge drop into Arianism. This tried to protect God's oneness by saying that Jesus, the Son, wasn't fully God, but was just a created being. Well, that divides God's very nature and makes Jesus less than God.
So the church navigated this knife edge through a series of really intense debates and councils. In 325 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, they fought back hard against Arianism, declaring the Son is of the same being as the Father. Then, in 381 at Constantinople, they made it clear that the Holy Spirit is also fully God and should be worshipped just the same. And finally, some brilliant thinkers we call the Cappadocian Fathers really sharpened the language into what became the standard. God is one being, three persons.
All right, so after that whole perilous journey, where did they finally land? Let's look at the solution they came up with, the standard, or orthodox, Christian definition of the Trinity.
Okay, here's the solution in a nutshell. They affirmed there is only one God, but this one God has always existed as three distinct co-equal persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now this is the really important part. While they are all fully God, they aren't each other. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit. They are one in their divine being, but they are three in their distinct personhood.
Now, to make this work, they had to get super specific with the language, and they landed on two key, and kind of technical, Greek words. The first is homoousios. This was the word that drew a line in the sand against Arianism. It means of the same substance. Not a similar substance, but the exact same divine essence. The Son is fully God.
The second incredible idea is a word called perichoresis. It basically means mutual indwelling. The best way to think about it is like a divine dance. The Father, Son, and Spirit are constantly moving in and through and around one another. They live inside one another, so the whole of God is in each person.
yet they always stay distinct. It's how they're so profoundly unified. You know, if all that Greek is a little much, here is a super simple way to keep it all straight. Just ask two different questions. First question, what is God? The answer, one divine essence, one being. Second question, who is God? The answer, three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That simple what versus who distinction is the balance they fought so hard to protect.
Okay, I get it. This can still feel pretty abstract. So let's get back to that big question from Karl Rahner at the beginning. So what? Why does any of this actually matter? How does this ancient, complicated idea connect to the real world?
Well, it turns out this doctrine has some massive practical implications. First, it completely shapes Christian worship. It's seen as this beautiful movement to the Father, through the Son, and by the Spirit. Second, it gives you a lens for viewing creation. It actually mirrors God's own unity and diversity. Third, it shapes our ethics because it reveals a God whose very nature is relational and self-giving love. And finally, some argue it even gives us a model for society, showing us how to balance freedom and order without falling into tyranny or chaos.
You know, one of those early church fathers, Gregory of Nazianzen, said something that just kind of stops you in your tracks. He said, when I say God, I mean Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. For him, the word God was just shorthand for this incredibly rich, dynamic relational reality, which is so different from how we often think of God today, as just this vague, singular concept.
And that right there, that's the heart of it all. At the end of the day, the Trinity isn't some intellectual puzzle we're supposed to solve. It's meant to be a window into the very nature of God. It's a declaration that before there was a universe, before anything existed, God was not alone. God was an eternal community of self-giving love. God is love, because God has always been this loving relationship of Father, Son, and Spirit.
So, far from being irrelevant, the Trinity offers this radical vision of reality, one that's grounded in relationship and in self-giving love. And it leaves us with a pretty compelling question, doesn't it? If the ultimate reality of the entire universe is a community of perfect love, how could that ancient idea maybe challenge and reshape the way we build our own communities, our families, and our relationships today?